Ross Geringer. Are body thetans, BTs, mentioned anywhere outside the upper OT levels in Scientology? In other words, would a non-OT Scientologist, including Sea Org, since they don't seem to be privy to any secret upper-level doctrine unless they have worked their way up the bridge the same as public, be aware of BTs? I assume the answer to both questions is no, and thus you yourself were not aware of the concept of BTs until after leaving the church and reading the OT materials online. What did you think when you read about BTs? To me, that's almost as big of a revelation as the Xenu story to learn that there are supposedly other thetans clustered on various areas of the body, causing all sorts of impairment. I would liken it to the discovery of bacteria and viruses and how revolutionary it was to see these previously unseen entities which have the ability to profoundly affect our health. Yeah, learning about BTs was not anything I knew about when I was in Scientology. I learned about it when I read the OT3 Zemu story online. And I'm just going to start calling him Zemu. I know everybody calls him Xenu, but the name is Zemu. And I clarify in my book why that's the case. Anyway, so no, I didn't know anything about BTs. Now, let me just comment on this because I think you'll find this kind of interesting. In Scientology's lower level materials and the non-confidential materials, there are a couple of places where Hubbard alludes to other entities or other types of beings, and he refers to them as entities. There are there's in the 1952 book, The History of Man, which was also called How to Audit. He talks about entities, and you get this, the way he describes them and talks about them in lectures and later lectures and whatnot is that they were originally thought of as sort of compartmented sections of the individual. You know, if you have or his mind, you'd have a thetan, a spiritual being, and he's got this mind, and it contains not just pictures and experiences of his experiences, but it also has mental machinery. And Hubbard said that the machinery is literally machinery, like cogwheels and little turbines and little things that a thetan would create to do work for him. Like if you could imagine, building a mental calculator or something, and that calculator would actually do calculations for you. It's not just a mock-up or a picture of a calculator that you're going to invent. It's an actual machine that exists up here, and I keep going here, although it really could be anywhere. It's physical. It's made of energy, but it's corporeal. You don't really see it or feel it or touch it. Anyway, this machinery exists, and the way Hubbard kind of explains it, if you read like all this stuff, you kind of get this idea that these entities are what he calls. He referred to them as circuits in Dianetics. They're walled off sections of the mind that act like other personalities, other beings. And so right from the Dianetics book, he's talking about circuits, mental circuits, like an electronic circuit. And maybe it's just a couple catchphrases, but then this evolved and developed into entities. Whole personality packages that the thetan creates, and they talk back to him and they act like a whole nother person. And sometimes the guy will take on those personalities, right? This isn't really clearly defined stuff. If I'm sounding a little bit vague or a little uncertain about this, it's only because Hubbard's materials are very vague and uncertain about this stuff. It's kind of like he's really making this stuff up as he goes. But this is lower level, non-confidential material that any Scientologist reads and knows about, is that there are these entities. And so the idea is it's part of you. Then there's another kind of entity, which is not you, which is its own thing, which is called a genetic entity. And this is the closest Hubbard ever came to the concept of what he later in 1967 said were body thetans and whole spiritual beings that are just like you as a spiritual being, except they're dead or nearly dead and just glommed onto you, right? The genetic entity Hubbard described early on, again this is 1952, 1953 material, this was the sort of vague, it was very hard. A lot of Scientologists really have a hard time getting their head around what the genetic entity is. And it was only really talked about in the 1950s. By the 60s, there wasn't any discussion about the genetic entity, and there wasn't any address to it or worry or concern about it. So it's kind of early stuff. But Hubbard posited this idea that bodies were sort of sustained and created by this genetic entity, which sort of went along from body to body along a genetic line and sort of developed bodies. And maybe the idea was that evolution, evolving bodies and things like that were brought about by these genetic entities. And the genetic entity, Hubbard said, there's a whole lecture on this thing. I think it was 1956. It's called Genetic Scientology or something like that, and or Scientology in the GE or some GE Scientology. That's what it is. GE Scientology is the name of the lecture, and Hubbard talks in this lecture a lot about this genetic entity. It says it lives in the stomach, that it is a very kind of a craven, sort of very primitive creature, that it wants to just eat and have sex and live and very primitive level of survival, and that he compared it to he talked about Genghis Khan. He said Genghis Khan was a very GE oriented individual, killing lots and lots and lots of people, building his tower of skulls and this sort of his mountain of skulls. That it was like that kind of primitive, raw, sort of, that's the GE, and it's going to survive no matter what, sort of thing. And it's very much all about its own survival. And so when people get hungry, really tired, things like that, the GE is kind of taking over. So that was what I remember about that. But I thought you might find that interesting as far as pre-OT level material about entities. Now, of course, when he developed OT3 in 1967, I think all this early material to the OTs is sort of considered, oh, well, Hubbard was really talking about BTs. But of course, because it was confidential, and Hubbard said it would kill you if you knew about it before you could, before you were aware of it, before you could be safe to be told about it. He didn't go back and clarify all this early material, but I think OTs pretty much imagine that the GE and these earlier entities and stuff that Hubbard was talking about are actually BTs, body thetans. So that is that's how that works in Scientology. And there's one final place in 1980. There's a bulletin called The Nature of a Being. And Hubbard there, well after the OT levels were all worked out, talks about entities and refers back to the earlier books. But I think he was just kind of covertly referring to body thetans, sort of, surreptitiously referring to his earlier 1950s material, but really talking about body thetans without saying it out loud, where in The Nature of a Being, he describes the fact that we are not simple creatures, that if all it was a body and a thetan, a spiritual being, it would be easy to get people all the way up to clear and OT, and it wouldn't be a big deal. But that man is what he called a composite being, because you have all these other factors involved, the mind and the entities and whatnot. So he sort of alluded to it there, but there was no hint of clusters and body thetans and Xenu and all that stuff. That's all confidential material. So there's my tirade on entities in Scientology.